Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I know that you enjoyed the program that aired in this past hour, Reshaping Greater New Orleans, Criminal Justice Change by Decree. I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. I am the Community Projects producer here at WYES, and we're in the WYES studio. And with me in the studio, Charles Maldonado, who is a reporter for The Lens, and he's done a lot of reporting about the police and jail consent decrees. Yeah. Then also Paula Pendarvis, who is my good friend and colleague, who is the producer of the program you just saw, of our special hour Change by Decree. And then we have by phone with us Loyola law professor Dane Ciolino. And I'm very happy that he's agreed to join us tonight too and explain a few things about this consent decree. And Professor Ciolino, we did see you in this program, and you sort of answered the question, you did answer the question, what is a consent decree, which a lot of people do wonder about. And so if you can just sort of elaborate more about how did we get here, you know, with these two consent decrees going at one time, as you pointed out, it's really going to be a big expense. And then how long could it last? Is this just sort of an indefinite thing where the federal government will just keep saying, no, it's not good enough, and we're going to stay in here and oversee you again? How long can this go on?
Well, it is an indefinite consent decree. It will last as long as it needs to last to solve the problems that were so long neglected. It's not going to be up to the federal government to decide when enough is enough on these consent decrees, or for the city or the sheriff's office. Ultimately, the federal judges overseeing these decrees will take evidence and hear about the progress of improvements both at the jail and in the NOPD, and then make decisions whether or not the consent decrees have been in place long enough. Now, in other states, other cities, where consent decrees have been involved to address constitutional problems, sometimes it's decades before the consent decrees are lifted. So there's just the short answer to your simple question is there is no answer. These consent decrees will be in place as long as necessary.
Paula, I know you had a question for
Well,
them.
it's the consent decrees state in the documents that in each of the cases that each organization must be in compliance for 2 solid years before there can even be a motion to make them go away. So that's a long time. I mean, 2 years of being in 100% compliance on everything, that's a tall order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Dane mentioned that in some cases they go much longer than they've originally been predicted to go. You know, we've heard a lot about 5 years for the NOPD consent decree, and maybe 4 or 5 years for the OPP consent decree. But as he mentioned, there are other cities. I believe both Oakland and Detroit have been under police consent decrees for more than a decade. Both cases predicted to go about 5 years, as the NOPD one has.
You know, I want to urge everybody who's watching, if you have a comment or a question, please send it in to us. Our email is rgnocj@wyes.org. That's rgnocj@wyes.org. And we do have one question coming in right now from a familiar name to WYES, Randall Feldman. Thanks for sending in the question, Randy. But he asked something that I think a lot of people in the city are thinking, how is the city going to afford this? How can we afford this? Dane, do you have any response to that?
Well, the short response is we've just got to afford it. There is no, even though there's been a lot of complaining, both from the sheriff's office and from the mayor, that the costs are unbearable. This is really, unfortunately, the time where essentially, you hate to use a cliche like our chickens have come home to roost, but this is the result of many, many years of constitutional neglect. And at some point, you've got to pay for it, and that time is now, and it's going to be for the next several years. And again, I use several very loosely because it could be 5, 6, 7 years, or it could be a decade or so. It's understandable that this is a very difficult financial burden for the city, but it's it's a debt that just needs to be paid.
And of course, if we're watching the legislature right now, there are a package of proposed tax increases that the city is asking the legislature to look at, where the voters of New Orleans, if the legislature agreed, would be asked to help pay. There was an attempt to raise the cigarette tax by 80 cents, and that one didn't make it. There's a suggestion of raising the hotel motel tax, and there may be some millages. So certainly the taxpayers are going to have to be burdened by this, and we've heard the city administration say before that they don't want to be in a situation where they have to take police off the streets to put deputies in the jail. But the money, Dane is right. It's when the federal courts tell you have to do it, there's no way out.
And we sort of have an idea of what the police consent decree will cost over 5 years, but we still really aren't sure about the jail.
Well, yeah, the estimate is about in the neighborhood of $50 to $55 million over 5 years. Now, the thing about the police consent decree is that's already figured into the budget, at least for this year. The prison consent decree, on the other hand, is really not at all. It did get an allotment in the 2014 budget, but it was only about $2 million. Basically, everyone, even up to the mayor now, is saying that it's going to end up costing at least $10 million a year, and maybe as much as $20 to $22 million a year. And the city's facing some, it's dealing with that. It's dealing with the situation with the fire pensions. These are some things that are very serious challenges to the next few budgets going forward in the city. And I actually wanted to the thing about the taxes. As you mentioned, the cigarette tax failed. Is the hotel motel tax still on the table? I thought that was. It
was heard in committee this week, and let me check.
So, I think it was still on the table last I checked.
I know the.
I don't know what happened today.
Right. I know the police and fire millages bill was scheduled to be heard in committee this afternoon, and I actually didn't see what happened with it. So. Yeah. But doubling those, the current version of that bill doubles the millages for police and fire, and even if that does make it through the state, I think that's probably going to be a tough sell locally.
Because locally, for one thing, it has to go to the state voters, and then ultimately would have to go to council, and then to the local voters.
It has to go to it has to go through a statewide vote, and there's a new provision in it that I believe it requires a separate city-only vote.
Yes.
So this has to pass through 2 popular votes, and asking people to add hundreds of dollars to their tax bills.
Plus our council. Before it would go to
and
a popular vote, it would have to go
Mm-hmm.
through the council as well. We have a question that came in, and this sort of it relates to mass incarceration and trying to see how we can lower that. And this comes from Ray Flick, and he's saying the marijuana laws, sheriffs need prisoners to make money. It's not about public safety. When will we as a state realize that the lead in prisoners per capita is not good? And we had this piece about Smart on Crime initiative, but really, where is that going?
Well, actually, what the leadership of this movement are saying is, yes, we have made the sheriffs reliant on heads in the bed. So what needs to happen is that there needs to be new incentives for the sheriffs to buy into this new way of thinking, which would be involve them, keeping people in jail is an industry for them. We'll give them a new industry. Let the sheriffs and the DAs run the reentry programs. Let them oversee the rehab program. So we've got to reinvent, their source of revenue, and that's something that they're really thinking of.
Dane, do you have any take on that? About the laws that are going through the legislature to try to reduce our number of prisoners and lower sentencing?
Well, the historical way that sheriffs have kind of been profiteers in an effort to try to make money and really kind of fill their coffers and run their operations by housing DOC state prisoners it was just not a tenable way to kind of maintain a local prison system. It is a systemic problem. It's not just an Orleans problem. It's a Louisiana problem. And that's something that the Louisiana legislature has got to step up to or understand, and then step up to the problem and solve it. There's always historically been this tension between New Orleans and the rest of the state, and but the rest of the state has got to understand, as we understand, that this is not just a local problem; it's a statewide problem.
Charles?
Yeah, I mean, those are very good points. I mean, and when you're talking about this being a money generator for local sheriff's departments in particular, I mean, locally they have and are still trying to lower the state convicted population in the prison. But in other other parishes, it's that doesn't seem to be the case. I was checking the numbers on it today, and I think now we have more people in state custody who are in local parish
Correct.
prisons than we do in state jails, and there's $180 million or something like that going to local jails to hold these people. So
More than half of the adult sentenced offender population are not in places like Hunt that we saw pictures of, or Angola. They're in, yeah, it's more than half.
In parish jails.
Yeah, and of course that sets up the perverse incentive for local sheriffs, and this has been the case in Orleans for many years, for local sheriffs to just take as many state prisoners as possible, stack them one on top of another, take the money, but not in turn provide the medical services, the food, the basic living conditions that are necessary to satisfy constitutional requirements.
Yeah, and they're not even really getting. I mean, it is a revenue generator for them, but it's not even as much as the city is paying out in per diem, which is which is. A lot of people say that's not enough too, but this is even less. This is in the low, if I remember correctly, I might be wrong, low to mid 20s, yeah, so per day. Where so it is a revenue generator, but it's not even enough to really keep them safely. So
I just checked the House Bill 1083 regarding the hotel motel tax was pulled from the floor. It's not dead. It could come up again, but hospitality industry opposition has been very intense, so that one.
Yeah, well, that was
won't.
what a 1.75,
1.75,
and that's on top of the voluntary assessment that was passed last year and
and
started
then went
to be
into
imposed this year.
implementation this year, and so that's on top of the 13% hotel tax that we have now, plus the hotel occupancy tax, which is 50 cents to $2 a night, depending on the size of the hotel. It's a lot of taxes in the hotels, and as Paul said, the tourism industry was very much against this, which. Right. Which made me think that it actually was going to be going to the city, even though the bill itself didn't require that it go to anything in particular.
But one way or other, the consent decrees are going to have to be paid for. They're here. They're not going away, and they're costly. Somebody's going to have to pay.
Yeah, and the city and actually. You mentioned earlier that Dane might have something to add about this. Why is it that the city, this financial relationship between the city and the sheriff?
Judge Afric in one of the hearings on the jail consent decree actually complained. He actually complained about, it's crazy. I think that the city is responsible for funding the jail, but they have no authority over anything. Dane, why is the law that way?
Well, that's just, that's the way it's always been down here. I wish I could give you the political and historical background for it, but I can't, unfortunately. That's just the way that it's been down here for a long time, and I agree completely with Judge Afric's thoughts. It's nonsensical. You need to have the responsibility and the purse consolidated in one political entity.
All right, let's move on. We have another question now. This one is from Legal Liz. And what is the average length of stay at OPP? Isn't it designed as a detention facility, not a prison? what percentage of detainees, in quotes, are actually awaiting trial in New Orleans, or are other parishes' inmates and/or federal prisoners, which we were just kind of discussing. But, you know, what is the average length? Who's in there in our jail?
You know, as was pointed out in the documentary, there's a lot of different types of criminals, or you know, different types of offenders in there.
Or alleged offenders.
Yeah, alleged offenders,
think
ranging from people with DWIs or failure to make court appearances to people who are awaiting trial on murder.
It's about 70% of the people in the jail are pretrial
Yeah.
detainees, and there used to be a lot more sentenced people in there. But if you're not detained, I mean, if you've already been sentenced, if you're serving a municipal sentence, you're going to stay in that jail. And they're still holding the Plaquemines Parish prisoners, which are about 70 or 80.
Right. And they're still holding some convicted state prisoners, although more and more the larger proportion of those is not, you know, state prisoners that they're just holding on sentences. They have more people who are in some sort of a work release program or you know, end of sentence program, reentry program.
It's clear they're going to have to move them out, though, because when the sheriff moves into that new building during the summer, there's just not. It's going to force the issue. There's not enough space.
Right.
Yeah, it's under 1,500. It's you know, 1,483 capacity, meaning that according to the city's expert on this, James Austin, you need about a 10% buffer on that. So that really can only hold a little over 1,300 people.
That's the only way you can do that proper classification system,
Right.
which has never happened for decades in the jail. And the temporary facility that they're going to keep has 500 beds, but then again, you have to. I think I heard Dr. Austin testify before the city council or one of the monitors testified before the council that they really can't hold more than about 300 in that facility.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, jail size certainly is still an issue, a question that's out there. Are some of the temporary facilities going to be allowed to stay open when the new building comes online? Isn't that
The temporary
to
facility,
allow more beds?
just the one that was newly constructed. It opened in 2010, I believe. That one that you can see when you're on the interstate.
Yeah.
It's right next to the new kitchen and the new physical plant and the new jail. That one, they originally wanted to keep one of the Templeman facilities open, but the monitors, upon touring it, said it wasn't appropriate. The newer temporary facility is much more adequate for the type of things that are demanded in the consent decree.
Yeah.
And there's still that chance that they're gonna push for a new building too. I mean it's something that it was, you know, the city was in talks with the sheriff for a long time, leading up to the construction on the current building. They have that kitchen warehouse space, and they have the new housing facility, and there's this big mysterious green space between the two of them. Sheriff Gussman has argued in the past that the city needs an additional facility holding about 600 people. You know, the point of the cap, the 1483 cap, was to reduce the number of people we have in jail in New Orleans. So a lot of people are opposed to that because it goes against that spirit.
Yeah.
And to have a constitutional jail costs a lot of money. So the bigger the jail, the more financial burden that it puts on the city.
And Dane, I wanted to get to that, a constitutional jail and a police department that also adheres to the Constitution. Can you explain that to us a little bit? I mean, what is a constitutional jail?
Well, a constitutional jail is one that imposes the punishment that has been at least for convicted prisoners, one that imposes the punishments that have been meted out by the sentencing judges in a way that's not cruel and unusual. And that essentially means that those prisons have to live up to modern standards, have to have head counts and square footage of jail facilities that are adequate under the circumstances, that prisoners are given adequate medical care. You know, it's not about making sure that the accommodations are luxurious, just above third world standards. And unfortunately, historically, in Orleans Parish Prison, we have not done much better than that.
But now with the new prison coming on board and the consent decree in place, the sheriff would say that we are working toward that, though. We're making these steps. Is that something that you see? I'm sticking with you right now, Dane.
There's no doubt that this new prison coming online is going to be an improvement. Are we making steps? Yeah, we're making steps. But given the historical problems and the length of time and the severity of these problems, that we've been suffering from these problems, it's not steps we need, it's strides. And we're making progress, yes, but it's not going to be as quick as some would like.
I'd like to say something about the new state-of-the-art jail. I was very happy to be able to tour it. It's amazing. It looks a lot like the jail that we visited in Caddo. It's got everything that one would want in the world of jails and prisons. And there's an electronic footprint, which is really interesting. All the gizmos that exist in the jail thing now, whereas the deputies are living and working on the tier with the inmates, they're going to leave an electronic footprint. So never again will there be somebody saying, I was on the tier. Well, we'll know where you were. We'll know that you passed this cell every 15 minutes if someone's on suicide watch. But it doesn't have the technology to say if the person looked and paid attention. So there is going to have to be a culture change, because you can prove where you were, but you still can't prove if you used your eyes.
And there's also going to have to be an increase in staff.
Oh yeah, that's what we're talking about. When we say that this consent decree is going to last however many years, the consent decree really lasts forever, because the consent decree is going to require that they get up to a minimum threshold of staff, which is going to be many more staff than they have now, and they can't, they can't just fire all those people once they're no longer under a consent decree. They're going to have to keep them in order to maintain the conditions that they've achieved at this jail. By the way, I did want to mention, you asked earlier if Sheriff Gussman felt we were moving in the direction of a constitutional jail. Sheriff Gussman actually never conceded that the jail was unconstitutionally run. It was a really sort of bizarre thing to see in the hearings on this, that Sheriff Gussman was arguing for the implementation of the consent decree while never conceding that the jail was unconstitutionally run, which is why you'd need a consent decree. And the city was arguing that the jail was unconstitutionally run, but the consent decree was unnecessary. Ultimately, the city, did change that argument somewhat and argue for a federal receiver, which was a little more consistent. But so it was just a very interesting and bizarre thing to see in that hearing.
And you point out that the consent decree keeps on going because of, for example, you have a number of staff, you just can't lay them off because perhaps the consent decree has been lifted. Remember that's something that the police chief also noted in his interview for the documentary, that for NOPD, this consent decree is going to be setting firm policy no matter who comes in down the line.
That's true. In NOPD's case, a lot of these expenses go on indefinitely as well. I mean, obviously not some of the costs. I mean, some of the costs are only up front, like new equipment, and that's going to last for quite a while. Some of it is buying new software, buying new systems, and then there's the monitor. That's obviously not going to go beyond the length of the consent decree. But yeah, a lot of this is going to be continuing costs for both of these agencies. I'm
going to go over to another comment right now, and this one, it's kind of broad. It's from John, and it says, "How is this acceptable?" How is this acceptable? I don't know exactly what this is. I'm kind of assume maybe the conditions of the jail, that the way this has been for so long, but maybe even more broadly than that. Dane sort of touched on it, is that these are problems that have not been addressed for decades and decades. How has this been acceptable? Who has an answer for that? Dane?
Well, at the end of the day, it has not been acceptable. We in Louisiana sometimes forget that we have to live up to national standards because we live in a federal constitutional state where there are minimum standards that must be followed by everyone, even us. And so the short answer is it's not acceptable, and it has not been acceptable, and we are paying the price for that now. The problem, the way we got there, is because when it comes time to spend money, the last people anyone wants to spend money on are prisoners. So it's easy in the political process to neglect the prisons because no one cares about prisoners. The Constitution, however, says you've got to care at some minimum level, and we do now.
And Mary Howell brings that out too in the documentary about how there just really has not been this real big community concern behind it, and it's something that there should be a big community concern and push behind it for all of these changes.
I know that the Orleans Parish Prison Reform Coalition, who was represented in the documentary by Norris Henderson, they have been doing a lot to try to make this something that everyone cares about. That's why it was important for us to include two of those family members. There were other families who also wanted to share their stories, and their stories are all heart-wrenching, but they wanted to be the voices of their lost children and lost brothers and sisters, because these people were not, that's what they weren't in there for anything violent. You know, substance abuse and missing a court date. And the point that they wanted to make is, you know, when someone gets booked into the jail on a minor charge, you expect them to walk out, but their family members didn't. So I thought it was important. I was trying to make the point of it could happen to any of us. You know, I've been in the booking center, you've been in the booking center when it's one of the few places in the jail they'll let us take pictures. And I've sat and listened to people being interviewed by the pretrial services department, and now some of these people are, they've never, it's their first brush with the criminal justice system, and they're going to be in there a few days because they can't get bonded out, and they didn't do anything violent. There's really no reason for them to be in jail, and nobody is suggesting, not the people for the Smart on Crime, no one's suggesting that violent criminals or heroin dealers don't go to jail. No one's suggesting that, and that's very important for people not to represent that. But yeah, it could happen to anybody. I mean, yeah, a traffic ticket. You could get beaten to death over a traffic ticket, is what the critics allege.
I mean, when you talk about it happening to anybody, when it was at its peak population of what, 7,500 people, that's 1 in 50 or so people in New Orleans. So yeah, it happens to quite a few people. So I mean, even at a lower population like it's at now, it's still still almost 1 in 100. So it can.
I'm going to go to another question on a little bit different topic, and it addresses really the detail system. Police details, and now sheriff's deputies are taking over some of the details that the police had before. Do they have to go through? The question is, in paid details for sheriff's deputies, is it happening without the same red tape as happens now with NOPD?
The sheriff's detail system, from what I have been told, is running the same way the NOPD detail system used to run before the consent decree mandated this Office of Police Secondary Employment. And people who watch what goes on in the police department and the jail very carefully have told me that they fear the aorta of corruption, which the police detail system was termed. They worry that the same thing's going to happen in the sheriff's department. I see sheriff's deputies all over town on details now. And so you have the same situation where it's not controlled. So there are concerns about that.
And so, Dane, do you think that there will be changes to the detail system? I know that there are calls for some changes to the detail system now, as exists now for NOPD, because officers are getting hurt, not getting the income, police officers.
Well, surely there's got to be a unified system within Orleans Parish to clamp one vessel for corruption, and then to leave another channel wide open for that corruption is absurd. So it seems to me that as a matter of policy, the same detail system needs to be in place for both sheriff's office and the NOPD. Now, what that detail system looks like, it should probably look something like the one that the consent decree contemplates, with certainly more central oversight over the officers. But on the other hand, you do want these officers to make living wages. You want good officers. You want competent officers. And one of the problems with Orleans Parish Prison over the decades has been incompetency in personnel. And you're not going to make any steps or strides with incompetent personnel.
How will it be done to make the changes within the consent decree for the NOPD as it relates to the detail system now? What are the mechanics of that, of modifying this or, changing it a bit?
Susan Guidry told us that she wishes that they could ask the judge to get it out of the consent decree. She doesn't believe it should be in it, that the specific requirement of how to change the detail, creating that office, shouldn't be there. I don't know, Dane, can somebody revisit a consent decree, or is it just the law of the land for eternity?
Oh, no, consent decrees certainly can be modified. Particularly if the Department of Justice and the city go with a single voice back to the federal court, to Judge Morgan, and say this is something that we want to change, odds are she would look at it hard and change it. But right now they don't have that unified voice. There's no doubt that the federal government is not at this early stage in the implementation of the decree interested in making major changes.
Yeah, the Justice Department actually wanted to get rid of police details altogether initially, and as for modifying them, the Justice Department has said in the past that it wanted them changed significantly. The particular way it's been changed, they don't feel one way or another about it. And to get to your earlier question, how it works, it's been centralized to an office called the Office of Police Secondary Employment. It's under a gentleman named John Ciolino. He's been there for, I don't know, about a year, and he has been coordinating these details, getting these clients very, very slowly, getting these clients online to go through his office, in which they pay each officer a set rate depending on the officer's rank, and portion of that goes to fund the Office of Police Secondary Employment. They're having a lot of trouble getting some of these clients to come online. A lot of these officers are not interested in going through this particular process. A lot of them have lost income based on the scale that they're using. So it's had a rocky start thus far.
And it's interesting to note that the major events are still being handled by the old-fashioned way of officers contracting their colleagues to do it. And even the police chief acknowledges that it's going to take some time for the Office of Police Secondary Employment, that's inside City Hall, to have the expertise to know how to pull off policing a jazz fest, policing a Super Bowl. And the New Orleans police are world-renowned for their ability to safely police world-class, enormous events. And so that's recognized that you can't just do that. So that's going to take a while, but I believe by the end of the year, everything is supposed to go through that office, which has nine employees inside City Hall.
One thing I also wanted to discuss, and I'm going to bring Dane, if you would first answer this. Who's watching to see if these consent decrees are indeed being followed? There's a monitor system, right, for each one. Could you explain that a little bit? And have any reports been issued or any due anytime soon?
Well, as far as the NOPD police monitor goes, I mean, that monitor was only relatively recently appointed. So, that monitoring process is still relatively new. And I'm not aware of when the next reporting cycle is.
Any day now.
Yeah.
If you go to consentdecreemonitor.com, it says mid-May is their second report, and they'll be holding a community meeting about it in June. I've been checking it every day, and literally any day now.
Yeah.
So there are monitors then if you could you explain that a little bit more, Dane? about
Yeah,
how the
and
monitors work?
the monitors are paid on a contract. There was a selection process, and these monitors are supposedly independent. They are looking at police practices and policies, and again, holding community meetings to try to appease and listen to community sentiment. So, again, relatively new process, at least in the city. There have been monitors in the other big cities that have had consent decrees. The mayor, of course, has complained that the cost of the monitoring is quite expensive, and it is. But it still remains to be seen how the monitoring process works down here.
Charles?
Yeah, I mean, it's as he mentioned, it's a major cost, and they have only released one report thus far, so we don't really, I can't say how successful this monitoring has been thus far, but ultimately they are the liaison between the city and the judge. They're the ones reporting to the judge.
And they're really keeping score, point by point, of every individual item, hundreds of them in each consent decree, and every time they issue a report, it says if they've complied, if not, or when the compliance is due. So it can be measured by everyone, and as taxpayers, you guys ought to check it out. It's interesting to look at.
And so if it's found that these points in the consent decrees are not being followed as required, what happens then? Who's accountable for this?
Ultimately, the city. I mean, the judge makes the decision based on these monitors' reports, and if the city is found to not be in compliance, the judge keeps this consent decree on, which means added expenses year after year after year. That's really ultimately the teeth behind this.
But there's also
Yeah,
the
and as a
contempt.
technical matter, the court could hold the city in contempt
Yeah.
of the judgment, and issue additional monetary fines, or I guess in theory, incarcerate someone. Though that's not ever likely to happen.
You know, the sheriff recently dodged a contempt motion. The judge dropped it. The fire standards. The jail was in non-compliance on fire code in the existing buildings, and the hearing was called off just days before it because the city and the sheriff convinced the plaintiffs in the case that enough was going to be fixed. There's a status hearing Friday, May 16th. About that, but there was already a contempt motion made already this early in the process.
Well, we've been taking a look with our special program and in this discussion at the consent decrees, the federal consent decrees for NOPD and also for the Orleans Parish Jail. I'm going to sort of wrap up this discussion right now with our guest here to see if you have any kind of final comments or statements. Dane, could I start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what more to say than I've already said, other than this is we're here because not because of anything the federal government has done or us being subjected to something from Washington. It's we've done this to ourselves. It's years of neglect. It is the result of not putting our money where the Constitution says it needs to be. So the time has come to pay, and it's not pleasant, and it's not going to be quick. But we don't have anyone to blame but ourselves.
And it's real. It's a real bill that we're going to have to pay. Paula?
I would encourage people to go and read the court filings, specifically the monitor's reports. It's really interesting. All of us have a stake in this. So very soon, all of those documents will be available at WYES.org. We've been a little busy working on the show. But it's really interesting reading, and at least from what I can tell, the monitoring process is very transparent. Also, the next City Council Criminal Justice Committee meeting later this month, the focus is going to be the jail, the whole meeting. And it's, people can watch City Council live sitting at their desk with a computer now. It's really, I hope people really start to pay attention to if the consent decrees are having the impact that they're intended to have.
Charles?
Yeah, and I'd also encourage people. It's sort of boring, but it's interesting to some people to read the consent decrees themselves and see what is required of these agencies ultimately. Because as this goes along, this is very important to all of us. And as to the bill, that's the thing that really I'm going to be watching very closely over the next coming months, because you know, we have all these added costs coming together. I'm very skeptical that these taxes that they're trying to push through the legislature are actually going to go anywhere. And on top of all this, you know, something that isn't even required in the consent decrees, the mayor is promising to get to 1,600 police officers by the end of his second term. You know, this is all a lot of money, and it'll just be interesting to see how it's going to affect the city budget.
So people of the city of New Orleans are going to really be feeling it. They will really be paying attention, I would guess, when they start feeling it in their pocketbooks.
I would certainly hope so, yeah.
You know, Paula mentioned something also about our website, and you're on our website right now looking at us, but it's WYES.org, as you know, and on our criminal justice web section within the WYES website, Paula will be posting the reports and any kind of other relevant documents, and we're also going to be sort of leading up to the fall elections. You know, this fall, the entire bench at Criminal District Court is up for re-election. Also, our DA is up for re-election. So Paula and I are going to continue our Reshaping Greater New Orleans Criminal Justice series, taking a special look at leading up to these elections. We will be doing some special reports and special programming, and then also we're going to build a website that's going to house comments and responses by candidates that we will be conducting once everybody, you know, has gone through qualification and everything, because we want to give you a better idea of who is running to be on the bench, in the Criminal District Court bench. So we'll be keeping you posted on that. That, of course, will be both on WYS on our air. We'll have some special reports, and then it'll be on our website to keep you updated. So I want to thank Charles and Paula and Dane. Thank you so much. It was good hearing from you.
Thank you for
and
having
we
me.
saw your lovely picture up there, and it was good to have you. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us for this.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys, and thank you all for tuning in, and stick with us. We're going to continue giving you more information about our criminal justice system through our special project, Reshaping a Greater New Orleans Criminal Justice. Thanks for joining us.